Hello. I want to talk today about it's a semi-personal theological thing, but it has broad meaning, I think, in the context of now. And I'll call it my Reinhold Niebuhr problem. I had a problem with Reinhold Niebuhr beginning when I was a student at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And this was a kind of establishment seminary, and Reinhold Niebuhr was almost, you might call him the crown of the liberal realist establishment. When I was at Union, there were other luminaries there, and Paul Tillich among them, Paul Ricoeur, various other people. It was a kind of, I would call it the swan song of establishment mainline Protestantism, because since then the interchurch center next to Union Theological Seminary up near Columbia is diminished, lost all of its most of its denominational occupants, and they've dispersed around the country some years ago. And essentially, Union Theological Seminary remains. They're going to sell some air rights, I believe, or do some kind of financial thing in order to remain in the city. That's an interesting issue. But Reinhold Niebuhr is venerated, maybe not to the extent almost worshipped now, as having been a person who was an eminent theological voice for justice and good things, but at the same time somebody who had a cogent and real sense of the evil in the world. And so I basically had with Reinhold Niebuhr a problem beginning fairly early when I was a student. I watched him take down a fellow named Joe Haratunian, who was lecturing there. Gave what I thought was a very good lecture about which ended up more or less pointing to love as being a fairly useful category of stuff. And at the end of this thing, the Reinhold Niebuhr was commenting on it, and he kind of leaned back and said, "Well, Joe, you sound a little bit like a sectarian." Oh my God, what a terrible thing to say about anyone in an establishment Protestant institution. Well, I don't think Reinhold Niebuhr knew, although I think I did, that this was an institution that was on its last legs, and that was fading fast, and that the church really had no theology upon which to proceed, including the theology of Reinhold Niebuhr, I'm sorry to say. And I don't think the church has got a theology until now, and it doesn't accept the theology that people like myself, exiles like myself, have spent maybe 50 years trying to fashion. That I call the theology both Abba's way and triadic philosophy, putting those two things together. I always wished that Reinhold Niebuhr had been willing to move a few degrees in the direction of the sort of activism that I think people like us should have and could have, and a few of us did do. We cannot lead. Not being privileged white male Protestants. Forget it. We're not going to lead anything, but we could lend our voices and our resources. This is the second area where I had a problem with Reinhold Niebuhr was around the issue of reparations. During the late 1960s, I got a good deal of publicity. I lived in the same town with Reinhold Niebuhr in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, during the 1970s. And that was following a fairly well-publicized, at the time, effort that I personally made to confront the Protestant denominations on the issue of reparations. I did it with the idea that the privileged white denominations should give up their endowments to the black community. That's basically what I proposed. I knew it was outlandish. I knew it was probably not about to be adopted. But I at least hoped that it would turn some heads and make them realize that as denominations, they weren't going to unify if they weren't going to give up their own turf. And as it turned out, I was right. They didn't give up their turf, and I was royally, more or less banished after that. The only ally I had was a fellow named Will Campbell, who was a bigger naysayer in certain respects than I have been. But at that time, we got put down, and Union seminaries, as conveniently, seems to have forgotten that this even occurred, even though I remember lecturing to you at Union about this. I think they've forgotten that it's occurred. But they're very wrapped up in worship of Reinhold Niebuhr, who, as far as I'm concerned, is the establishment who, believed in what I call kind of stasis. It was an impotence, an inability to act, because he and the rest of the denominations they were aware of the difficulties. They were aware of the existence of evil. They were aware of the problems. They did not want to do what they might have been able to do had they been willing to respond to creative leadership. Reinhold Niebuhr, once categorized the institutional church as trivial. I never thought it was trivial. I thought it was a bunch of people who could theoretically be mobilized to represent the person they considered their founder, who was a Prince of Peace, so-called, somebody who thought, yes, of course there is evil, of course there is demonic stuff going on, But it doesn't mean that we can't do anything about it, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything about it. Stasis. In any case, my problem with Reinhold Niebuhr became personal after I wrote a book called Sermons Not Preached in the White House, which had an introduction by Reinhold Niebuhr, which was given by permission of the magazine that he helped edit, was helped found, called Christianity and Crisis. Well, this got into a very complex little legal wrangle in which nothing ever came of it. But at that point, then this was in the wake of the reparations stuff, that I wasn't high on the list of whatever, for being a buddy of Dr. Niebuhr. In any case, in retrospect, looking back on the whole thing, I still think that Protestantism has, the liberal Protestantism has basically theologically lost it. Lost it because they have more or less held to the creedal formulae without doing the work necessary to move beyond it. And until we can move beyond it to some form of universal spirituality, I think we're cooked. But that's my opinion, and the church has done pretty well without it for some time. Anyway, that's my Reinhold Niebuhr problem.